Hello, it's Andy from PCR Global and Fit for Purpose. Just thinking aloud whilst preparing my slides. Risk assessment, health and safety, planning. It falls into ISO 45001. That's the planning clause, a big risk assessment clause. Also for NEBOSH, they've got a 4-part risk assessment requirement, which I like to use. They follow the HSE, I follow them and the HSE. I think it's the right way to do it. I do use matrices every now and again. I'm pushing on. All roads lead back to the risk assessment. That's the important part. Hazard identification, risk assessment and determining controls. And that's required under multiple regulations. And sometimes this type of risk assessment is not going to lend itself for that. If you're doing hand-arm vibration, then potentially you've got to have lots of different information is going to go in there. Same as noise. So you can't just use a document like that and fill it out with what we think. We've got to get evidence from elsewhere. 45,001 again, legal and other requirements. That's a clause in 45,001. I'm going to talk about methodologies because here's 45,001 again, 6122. That requires an organisation to document its methodologies on how it undertakes its risk assessment, scope, nature, timing, and they want that documented. The way I do that personally, you can see there I've got multiple risk assessment methodologies, what legal requirements, when they're completed, who completes them, who they consult with, templates, when they're reviewed, and minimum competence for undertaking risk assessments within the company. Planning your risk assessment, that's what we're talking about. I also like to think of 3 big things: the law, practical use, and corporate knowledge. The law, we've got to know the law for a general risk assessment. Otherwise, how are we going to give that right advice? Practical use, really important. I'm not from a construction background, so I don't drive diggers, I don't drive cranes, so I'm not skilled and competent and have a history of practical use. That means I've got to understand and work out and learn. Otherwise, my risk assessment is going to be found wanting, isn't it? So, industry guidance, the work at height regs, HSE web pages, the Ladder Association, LA45, caretaker death, enforcement notices. What is this for? Planning my risk assessment. I'm going to make sure I look at all of these, so then when I produce my report for my risk assessment, I'm going to know that within the working at height regs, let's check that it is. Yes, it is. Within the working at height regs, we have inspection of work equipment, and we also have Schedule 6, I think it's 6, yes, requirements for ladders. I'm also going to know and be sure to have looked through the HSE web pages and the Ladder Association and LA455, if this is for ladders, because this is the one I'm talking about at the moment. And also, I like to ensure I understand prosecutions and enforcement notices. And this was a terrible death of a caretaker due to failure to plan. I like that because that gives me an argument if I'm going up against somebody saying we don't need to do it. And then also enforcement notices. I like to go on the website and understand what companies are getting picked up for in this area. You have failed to ensure measures. You have to look, I think, ladders on you. Yeah. Scaffold, suitable, unsafe use of step ladders. Right. So I like to get that enforcement notice. And then practical use, we're thinking of manufacturer's guidance. So manufacturer's guidance, if I click in here, manufacturer's guidance. So you can see there how to use things safely. Stabilizing accessories, ladder stabilizers, various different type of accessories. Again, I don't climb up ladders for a living, but I've got to know about ladders. That's planning for your risk assessment. Training courses and supervision requirements. Then back into that corporate knowledge, we're going to be looking at policies, procedures, and any previous reports. So planning for risk assessments. One more, hazard identification checklist. You hear me talking about this quite a lot. Make that checklist and have it specific to the area you're going to be looking at. So lots of planning before we even do that risk assessment. Really important, that PME. And the last one, just a quick overlook there. So we're looking, no matter what organisation we're in, we've got to plan, or industry, we've got to plan for that risk assessment. We're looking for organisational resilience. That health and safety policy is really important. The arrangements are going to dictate who, what, when, how, the arrangements for ladders, the arrangements for abrasive wheels. And that's going to give us our guide for our risk assessment. We need that competent advice, risk assessment, consultation, training, all part of the risk assessment process. Construction, if it's to do with construction, contractor due diligence, incident investigation, all these areas, health surveillance, emergency response, all part of a suitable and sufficient risk assessment that you would have looked at in regards equipment, worker height, hazardous substances, stress, noise, vibration, fire. We know there's a lot of talk about workplace stress at the minute, with the HSE pushing and saying it is a thing to risk assess it. I've got my own company. I wouldn't want my guys stressed. I constantly do a risk assessment on that. We're looking for happy staff, all part of the risk assessment. All roads lead back to it. And that's where this crosses over with audit as well. We do our risk assessment, but then we audit our risk assessments. We could do an audit of the risk assessment methodology before doing a risk assessment to see where we are. It both lends itself. It's a crossover. And as always, we should be looking for those misleaders. But it really is important, that health and safety policy. That's going to should dictate how we are going to do our risk assessments. Statement, responsibilities, and arrangements. And that should be in there. That's it. Quick talk through, just testing some slides, doing a risk assessment. All roads lead back to that risk assessment.